For thousands of years, humans have lived in the Great Plains of North America, where, in a arid, harsh landscape with little vegetation, a hunting strategy was developed that was so efficient and sustainable for the people living there that it remained in use and mostly unchanged well into the 19th century. This tactic was known as the buffalo jump, which is what I've diorama modeled here in my largest attempt so far on this channel. Essentially, this hunting strategy would involve driving a herd of bison over a cliff edge into a cauldron or culvern, and they would die en masse to be harvested by an entire tribe. This hunting strategy was so successful that it remained in use even despite disruptive new technologies like horseback riding and guns being introduced to those same tribes. So, hi all, welcome back to Ground Up History, and I am not a plains bison, thankfully. Alright, so I started off this diorama with a kind of weird off piece of foam that I got as packing material, and then just kind of this flat piece representing the sort of basin of the cliff. Because what I'm trying to do with this diorama is build out a sort of sandstone eroded cliff face that you might see in the either southern Alberta or Montana regions of foothill prairies kind of leading up towards the Rocky Mountains. Now, the practice of buffalo jumps were performed all over the plains for thousands of years, nearly 6,000 years. And in all honesty, this diorama is actually probably a little bit higher than it needs to be. Because if you've never seen a plains bison, they are huge animals, incredibly heavy. So you didn't actually need to get them to jump off a particularly high ledge for them to die, simply because the mass of them hurtling over and impacting was enough generally to kill them upon the impact. The excellently named World Heritage Site in Alberta, Head Smashed In Buffalo Jump, is a very on-the-nose declaration of what these places were and how they worked. But it is a little bit more complicated than just that, because convincing a buffalo to jump off of a cliff required a lot of planning, execution, and risk on behalf of the hunters. Because of how big these animals were, it was dangerous to drive them into a stampede, and given that for thousands of years that this hunting tactic was employed, people didn't actually have access to horses, it meant that they were hunting these animals on foot, which is likely part of the reason why this hunting tactic became so well developed and it's successful, because it allowed for the mass killing of an animal without having to chase it for days or weeks on end to the point of exhaustion. So what you see here is me carving out these little chunks of foam, and that's because I'm actually going to be painting some of this foam directly. What I'm going to do is actually cover this model in a sort of plaster mix like I've done with previous dioramas, but I wanted to leave some of the foam sort of carved and exposed to represent kind of a rocky texture, because what I'm trying to do is build out a sort of water runoff texture of the cliffside, so there'll be some kind of smooth plaster sections and then some rougher sandstone areas that the water wouldn't have eroded over. The landscape of the foothills and the plains in general are very much molded by the recession of the actual glaciers from the previous ice age in North America. So it's a very roughly carved landscape with all of these crazy rolling hills and dramatic cliffs and rocky encroachments. And this environment is what allowed for this kind of buffalo jump tactic to be developed, because it's sort of the perfect area where buffalo can still roam and take advantage of the grasslands, but there are all of these kind of natural cliffs with wide open basins below them. Because the other side of this isn't just that you need to successfully hunt the bison, you also need to be able to process them. Having a wide open low basin allows for the entire tribe to spend the next few days just processing down the animal carcasses. So you can see me here now actually laying out some of that plaster mix I was talking before, and this is sort of painted and mixed roughly to give a kind of nice texture and color to the ground, because I'm not going to fully cover this diorama in flocking. I want there to be some exposed groundwork just to give that kind of rough prairie landscape vibe that I want to sell for the rocky sandstone badlands. Now, over the course of these thousands of years, obviously life on the plains would change, new peoples would move in, especially as Europeans increasingly became a presence. But what's so fascinating about the buffalo jumps is that they were still employed even in this changing environment. And in fact, even some of the new peoples who moved into the plains after being pushed out of their own original homeland by European colonizers would even learn from and adopt these same hunting tactics, working with plains people who had been there for a very long time. One of the examples of this would be, for example, the Blackfoot Confederacy in northern Montana and southern Alberta, who had been in the plains for a very, very long time, thousands of years. They made extensive use of the buffalo jump hunting tactic, but they allied with other tribes, including the Dene tribe, the Tsuut'ina, who moved into the plains sometime after the Blackfoot had been there and adopted many of the lifestyle traits of the plains people who had already been there. As well as more people began moving into the prairies, they also brought with them horses and guns. And while this did allow for a more individual approach to hunting, including hunting of buffalo, the buffalo jump system was still so efficient and effective that there was little need to change it. Now, riding a horse to drive the buffalo into a stampede was certainly safer than having to do it on foot, but in fact it even appears that they continued many of their on-foot tactics because it just worked so well. So let me explain what those tactics were. Essentially, to get the buffalo into position, there would be a buffalo runner, a very dedicated and skilled hunter who would be taking on an incredibly risky role. And he would drape himself in a buffalo hide to disguise himself as a buffalo. And he would creep near the herd and begin to lure them towards a designated position. Other hunters would also be covered in either buffalo hides or with wolf hides, and they would be sneaking up in positions around the buffalo as well, keeping sure to not be actually down or upwind from the buffalo so that the buffalo could smell them and run. This stealthy, dangerous approach to the hide was what allowed them to get close enough to the buffalo and excite them into a stampede, but it meant that the buffalo runner who was at the front of the herd leading them towards the cliff would literally have to start running and then jump into the cliff and hide somewhere inside the cliff face so that the buffalo would jump and fall around them. This was an incredibly dangerous job and is wildly impressive. And once they had done that and the buffalo began to stampede, the other hunters would also come out and scare up the buffalo to get them to continue running over the cliff. Usually this hunting tactic would also be employed with the sun in mind, because if the buffalo's eyesight was blinded by the sun, they would often have a hard time seeing the ledge before it was too late. Buffalo, being large herd animals, generally run as a group, so once you start getting a few of them going over and enough of them excited into a stampede, even if one reaches the ledge and tries to stop, the weight of all the buffalo behind it will cascade it over the ledge. Now, you can actually see there was a few flashes on the screen there. I was doing this over the course of a storm in my city, so that was lightning, which is a little bit funny. But you can see I'm kind of painting in this sort of rough texture, and I really like how the ground looks here with the kind of craggly surface that plaster created and then is highlighted by that kind of dry brushing of the light beige and grays. And I'm just filling in those colors now to just sort of build up layers of color. I wanted to go for a kind of reddish tan sandstone color ultimately, but I really wanted to build up a nice base of browns and grays before getting to that kind of redder tone. So filling all of that in again with kind of this sandstone prairie vibe in mind, but a lot of the prairies actually were quite lush. The prairie environment... Oh, there's my cat. She really likes to help when I'm building dioramas. So, a lot of the prairie environment has actually radically changed by the loss of the plains bison. Because despite this hunting tactic on the surface seeming quite decisive, so to speak, killing a huge group of animals all in one go, it was actually incredibly efficient and sustainable, because an entire tribe was hunting an entire herd of animals all at once. it was almost a more controlled approach to the hunting of these animals. You were all killing all of these animals all at once, but then harvesting it all down to sustain you for a very long period of time. And the processing of the buffalo would include essentially all of the animal. You would process down the hides to make into covers for teepees or into clothing or blankets. You would obviously harvest the meat and dry it, making it into things like pemmican, which was basically a dried pulverized meat, often mixed with berries, that would then be covered in buffalo fat, and that would basically keep for decades potentially. So when you had things like pemmican and buffalo hides, even things like sinew being turned into string, buffalo organs being used for various purposes, or even just the bones being boiled to get the grease out of the marrow, there are all kinds of ways that every part of the animal was used. And then there was also spiritual practices. In often cases, the buffalo skull was considered an important spiritual symbol and would be used in ceremonies before upcoming hunts. As such, the processing of the buffalo was both an economic and also a spiritual and cultural role, and would gain artifacts that would be used in important events like Sundance, which is basically a ceremony and celebration amongst Plains peoples that is sort of a major cultural touchstone of both faith and a gathering of people. And these buffalo hunts were also a communal gathering of people. You would have feasts, you would have celebrations before the hunt, you would give offerings and ceremony to ensure a good hunt. So this style of hunting was a huge cornerstone of prairie life. You can see here I'm trying to build a teepee at the bottom, and I've never done it before, so I didn't do a great job with it. But I wanted to symbolize the kind of people down below who would be waiting for the buffalo to jump over, because while the buffalo would often die on impact, they wouldn't necessarily, and hunters below the cliff would actually have to move in and finish the animals off. And then very quickly, the whole tribe would want to get together and begin processing down the hides, because if you're killing hundreds of buffalo in one go, you really do need to actually move in as fast as possible to clear out as many of the hides before they start to go rancid. So, this would be a huge undertaking to process down all of these animals all at once. You can see I'm actually filling in a few little trees here. Because this is a kind of rain runoff cliff, I wanted to have a little bit of vegetation. The prairies aren't dead. They're not just a desert, right? There's lots of grasslands, and especially because of how many nutrients buffalo actually put into the land, you can see I'm having a lot of trouble with these trees. In future, I would probably just use a small drill and drill a hole in the foam and plaster to just insert the tree into, but I decided to try and use green stuff like sticky putty to stick the trees into, and yeah, it gave me a lot of trouble, so I'm not going to try that one again. Eventually, I get them to mostly stand up straight, but yeah, there they go. Very frustrating. So, once that's all dried, I'm actually preparing both the canvas for the teepee, as well as preparing a small hide that I was going to put on that little post you see there. Now, obviously, like I said before, generally this hunt would be executed by having somebody wearing a buffalo robe and running in front of the buffalo. I didn't have like a miniature person to paint and use in this diorama, so instead I wanted to show a different tactic that was also sometimes employed, which was essentially creating an enclosure that would drive the buffalo over the ledge. Now, you would still have a buffalo runner at the front and people to scare them up, but by laying down rocks and sometimes even building fences with hides laid over them, you could create a kind of drive for the buffalo to go off a specific point of cliff that you wanted them to. And the creation of these enclosures was also used for other animals, namely pronghorn, a North American antelope. They don't actually like to jump over something that they can't see through. So one of the ways in which indigenous peoples hunted the antelope was by driving them into a natural basin and then surrounding that with a kind of fence work of hides so that they wouldn't be able to move. In this case, you can see I'm painting that canvas that I cut for the teepee, and this was a mistake because when I originally measured it, For one, I measured it facing a different way, so you can see the door looks a little bit weird there. It doesn't quite wrap around right, and it's a little bit over on the top. Also, when I painted it and dried, it dried a little bit tighter, so the size shrunk, so definitely made some errors with the teepee there. I'm also trying to lay down some flocking around the actual base of the buffalo's feet, just to make it look like they were running. And, you know, it didn't quite work. Like, the buffalo are a little bit solitary. They don't have a lot of motion behind the sculpt of that miniature, but I'm still happy with it. And here I'm just gluing in some rocks and painting them to kind of match the rest of the scene. So those will need to dry, and then I do some final touch-ups later. But ultimately, this is the end of the diorama. Just a few more touches of flocking, and then I just have to paint the surrounding. And this was a tedious portion just because it's painting black and trying not to get it on the diorama itself. But after many days of letting plaster dry and paint dry, this one was finally done. And I think it looks really cool. I really like that sandstone vibe, the vegetation, the prairie grass. I'm really pleased with how this one came out. And yeah, the teepee didn't turn out great, fully acknowledge that one. And in future, it would be cool if I had, you know, more buffalo and people to use. But I think it looks great, and this is very fascinating history. So I hope you enjoyed the video and the discussion around it. So there's the finished diorama. I'm very pleased with how this one came out. At first I was a little bit daunted by trying to scale out and trying to do a diorama this size, but it turned out a lot better than I was expecting. I'm really pleased with how it came out. I think the rock face looks great. I think the flocking really sells the kind of prairie landscape vibe that I was going for. There's some things that I would do differently were I to try this one again, but overall I'm really happy with how it came out. And this history is absolutely worth learning more about. If you want to go to a very cool World Heritage site, even just to say you've been there, it's called Head Smashed In Buffalo Jump. Great name, even just telling people that's a place you visited is worth it. It's in Alberta, Canada, and it has a conservation center and website that just really does go into a lot of this history and just the fascinating way of life that used to sustain people across the plains of North America. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.